In this class, we're going to talk about how important and influential typography has been throughout history, especially in the graphic design world. Today, we have so many different styles of type, from serifs and sans serifs, black letter, decorative, scripts, and the list goes on, each being utilized in a different way. With the written word, which is basically anything you are going to see and easily decipher, there's a serious component to what you are communicating, as in the content itself, but there's also this stylistic component that can have a heavy influence on how the viewer sees and feels that written information. So together, we're going to go on a journey that is going to deepen your typography knowledge and give you a framework for how fonts came to be and give you knowledge of how to wield your type skills. We'll start in the ancient days of communication around 3000 BC, then go from calligraphy to movable type, and we'll eventually end up at your digitized fonts that you use on your computer every single day. So let's get started. Now, reach back with me to your middle or high school days, and you might remember studying some of the ancient civilizations as well as their forms of communication. Probably one of the easiest to remember is Egypt, right? The pyramids, hieroglyphs, symbols, and illustrations. You might remember hearing the word cuneiform while studying Mesopotamia and Egypt. These were pictographic and logographic systems that didn't resemble the modern alphabet, but still communicated something through a drawn visual. A lot of this communication paved the way to what we eventually see as the Greek alphabet, developed in the 8th century, which introduced vowels, and the Romans later adapted it into the Latin alphabet, which forms the basis for most Western scripts that you know and use today. And here is where things get pretty interesting. During the medieval period, we see monks taking on the role of scribe, and their entire job was to perfectly write the religious texts by hand over and over again. And these, in my opinion, are some of the most beautiful letter structures based around a rounded or uncial shape. And I actually have some type specimen sheets right here to show you what I mean. Now, this isn't exactly what you might be seeing in the medieval period, but it's a good idea to explain the kind of rounded nature, or you might have heard the word Lombardic or something similar in your study of typography. And here's an example of what a manuscript might look like with all of those letters together like this in a format for something like a book. Now, these rounded or multi-stroke script styles evolved from a round letter to a more formal and legible Carolingian minuscule style in the 8th and 9th centuries under Charlemagne's influence. These letter forms, as you can see, are a bit sharper and more defined, and certain connecting points of the letters were easier to decipher. Now, this evolution from fancy round strokes to more formal straight letters laid the groundwork for future typefaces to be formed. But before we jump ahead, we have to talk about the unmistakably beautiful period of black letter and Gothic scripts. And I mean beautiful for the letters, not so much the time period. Now, I'm sure you've seen black letter script, even if you didn't know that that's what that style was called. There's no medieval or fantasy style game or movie or Irish pub or tavern that doesn't use lettering like this. Everyone knows Lord of the Rings, right? You can think of your Elvish inscriptions, or maybe if you're a Game of Thrones fan, you can think of all the times you see writing or a letter on screen. And just a quick fun fact to share with you, here at Kittl, we take typography pretty seriously, and it's an honor to show you that the newer Hogwarts Legacy game actually uses almost all of our custom vintage fonts in Hogsmeade. As you can see here, this is actually a pretty good example of what I mean by matching a typographic style to the time period that it is known for. But back to the actual history, in practical real-life terms, these dense, thick, and angular letters were used widely throughout Europe and were common in religious and more scholarly texts, like when I was talking about the scribes. Personally, I think Gothic scripts and black letter is absolutely beautiful. I'd love to know what you think in the comments, but eventually it became obvious that they were pretty challenging to read. And there are several reasons for this, but the most common one that I believe probably caused issues were certain letter combinations and multiple script styles happening at the same time. For example, letter combinations like M and M, M-I, N-I, U-I, I-U might have been difficult to distinguish, especially in dense paragraphs where words with those combinations were used often. Regardless of the reason, the legibility issue, as well as the speed at which the scribes could physically write and produce copies, put a lot of stress on the past institutions to figure out a way to make things more widely available and obviously more easy to read. And eventually, we find ourselves at the turn of the 15th century with the introduction of the first printing press. In 1440, we get the proper invention of movable type by Johannes Gutenberg, which revolutionized and rapidly increased the production of the written word. And you might have heard of the Gutenberg Bible, the first major printed work, and that Bible was set in a typeface that mimicked the standardized Gothic script so that every single copy looked exactly the same. And I actually have a fantastic book here called 500 Years of Printing that goes through the full history of the printing press. It's extremely interesting to read and understand how all of that formulation was made. And if you want to learn more, you can find a link to this book down in the description on my Drew's book list link. So this mass production of perfectly replicated text led to a standardization of letter forms that actually helped spread literacy and knowledge across Europe. And now we're going to look at some pivotal times throughout history where type has evolved into what we see today. Earlier, we briefly mentioned how the Romans took the initial Greek alphabet and turned it into a more fleshed out list of characters. And after the printing press was born, we start to see sets of these Roman typefaces that were inspired by classical Roman inscriptions that you would see engraved on stone. This Roman style featured more geometric, straight lines and components, which you know today as serifs. A serif, for any of you who are new to type design, is a line or stroke that is attached to the end of a larger stroke in a letter. And a typeface or a family of fonts that use serifs is called a serif typeface. Think Times New Roman, Baskerville, or Garamond. These are your classically influenced Roman typefaces that we use today. And for all of you history buffs out there, I want to mention a few key figures throughout the 16th century with major accomplishments for type. First of which was Nicholas Jensen in 1470, who created one of the first Roman typefaces in Venice and has been called one of the first highly legible and balanced sets of type. Next, we have Aldus Manutius in 1495, who first introduced italic type, which was originally designed to save space on the page. And coincidentally, his press became synonymous with high-quality books. And that's easy to understand, right? Because when you see that italic serif type, you already are thinking of something a bit more elegant. Maybe when you are reading a book, you're thinking that it's supposed to stand out as more important than the rest of the text. So this italic and elegant nature coming together makes sense. Another name you might know is Claude Garamond, who you probably already guessed developed the famous Garamond typeface, one of the most widely used old-style serif fonts that remains influential to this day. Now, once we arrive in the 1600s, transitional typefaces emerge, and these sets of type bridge the gap between the classical old style and the modern new style. These typefaces feature more contrast between thick and thin strokes, and while we still have the presence of the serif, it's much more subtle and not quite as loud as the classical Roman-style typefaces. And we also have some key figures during this time period as well, like William Caslon. His typefaces, particularly one named after himself, Caslon, became highly popular and was used in the printing of the Declaration of Independence, as well as other books and other mediums where large bodies of text needed to be printed. And it's really cool to see how variations of his original typeface have been created over the years, even into the 2000s. I actually have a type specimen of the Caslon type right here for you to see, which is actually pretty neat. And it even says on this type specimen sheet that this type is one of the best in modern use. Another well-known name is John Baskerville, known for creating the Baskerville typeface. Designed and highly refined, this and other transitional typefaces had greater contrast between thick and thin strokes, and the eventual innovations in printing techniques, and similarly to Caslon, the Baskerville type was perfect for setting books and other large bodies of text. As we move into the 19th century, we still see the wide usage of serif typefaces, but with an even greater distinction between individual strokes in letters. And thus, we have the Didone typefaces. And this style of text features extreme contrast between thick and thin strokes and a lack of what's called bracketing on serifs. What bracketing means is that the serifs have a nearly constant width along their length. It's a little bit easier to visualize with something like a slab serif type, where the letters have thick block-like serif and generally have no brackets. Because of this, these typefaces are often used in large headlines and advertisements. And we have two key figures to talk about here, which might be obvious to you type nerds, but the first one is Bodoni, creator of the Bodoni typeface, which presents the modern typeface style along with its high contrast and rational design. And I'm sure everyone knows Calvin Klein, right? The brand. Well, that C and the K of the logo type is a specific usage of the Bodoni typeface. Another name is Firmin Didot, and his Didot typefaces were similarly influential, emphasizing geometric precision and sharp contrast. You might have seen the Zara logo type out and about, which is a custom usage of the Didot typeface. Now, the other side of the typographic movement is the rise of sans serif typefaces. I'm sure everyone was wondering when we would get there. The Industrial Revolution brought along new demands for advertising and large-scale print. And because of this, sans serif typefaces were developed, which were bold, felt modern, and they were even easier to read. A sans serif letter or typeface is a letter that does not use a serif. The word sans actually means without or lack of. So you could literally translate this phrase to read without a serif or a lack of serifs. Now, the first creator of a sans serif typeface was William Caslon IV. And yes, we're talking about the same Caslon family from the 1700s. Now, this first sans serif typeface was often referred to as Egyptian or Caslon Egyptian. And you might be asking, well, where did Egyptian come from? The aspect of that getting attached to the name, because that doesn't even sound very modern, at least not to me. And you can read more into this because some articles will say that it's because of the blocky and flat style of early Egyptian writing and architecture, while others will say that it is because of the popularity of Egyptian artifacts in Europe during this time. But whatever the case, this new flat style of type was actually not very popular at the beginning. It wasn't until the mid-1900s where sans serif type was widely used and accepted. But before we get there, we have a few other integral players in advancing modern typography. In 1832, Vincent Figgins popularized both the slab serif and sans serif typefaces. Slab serif letters have thick block-like serifs that were used for advertisements, posters, and they're very easy to read. Today, you might think of Western films where a wanted poster uses a slab serif font, but much of the advertising in the early 1900s used this style of type as well. Figgins is also noted as one of the first type foundries owners to sell, quote, a fat face or ultra bold typeface, which were, of course, great at catching attention on advertisements or labels. And how could we make a video without mentioning our nearest and dearest Helvetica, developed by Swiss type designers Max Meidinger and Edward Hoffman? Some of you may know the original name, Neuhaus Grotesque, which rises to fame starting in 1957. Their goal in creating Helvetica was to make a neutral typeface that had massive clarity, no intrinsic meaning in its general form, and could be easily used on a wide variety of signage. And they definitely accomplished that goal. I mean, this is the classic designer joke, right? What font are you going to use? Helvetica. Or maybe you've seen some memes or skits like that, like every designer's favorite font is Helvetica. And that's kind of true for a reason. I mean, they really nailed it. And almost every similar typeface after that is kind of just a pseudo copy that plays off the greatness of Helvetica. Now, I just Googled this without any official digging, but since its creation, Helvetica has been used in over 50 famous work marks, according to Google. For example, the North Face logo is just Helvetica bold. Now, before we continue into the modern era of super clean and minimal type, I want to go through the beautiful period of sign painting and vintage-inspired typography. So buckle up, because this is my favorite era for type, and we're going to go deep. During the 1920s up through the 1950s, the art of sign painting flourished, and it has massively influenced typefaces and design practices we see today. This period of lettering had an emphasis on bold and decorative letter styles that were both functional and highly aesthetic. Hand-painted signage was an essential part of public life. Businesses, theaters, restaurants, and advertisements on buildings relied on heavy and large eye-catching hand-lettered signs. There wasn't a local or corporate sign shop that could make you a giant metal cutout or an LED-lit sign or quickly print you some vinyl decals that you could easily apply like you can today. So this practice required skilled artisans known as sign painters to manually craft type using brush strokes, often incorporating elaborate serifs, scripts, and decorative elements. So these bold and highly legible letter forms were designed to grab attention from a distance, often with thin strokes and contrasting elements. We also see highly decorative flourishes where ornamentation and hand-drawn details were celebrated. Some of these were a custom, one-of-a-kind design, and since these signs were handmade, they were often unique to each project or business, adding a sense of personality. You might think of carnival-style lettering, like for a circus or something like that, and you always have that beautiful kind of pointy decorative style of letters across a carriage. Now, like I mentioned, there was no easy way to make massive signage, so during this time in history, drawing letters was a necessity. Although there was a large industry for typesetting, as we've talked about already, it was often unsuitable for certain areas and mediums, such as large signage or multicolored advertising posters. With sign painting, though, size wasn't an issue, and the artist could adapt easily to the environment or the texture that they were working on. And many modern typefaces today draw inspiration from vintage sign painting. Fonts like Lobster, Pacifico, and brush script channel that hand-painted cursive style that were prevalent in signs during this era. And this mini resurgence of hand lettering in graphic design today pays homage to the artistry of sign painters. This influence can be seen in branding, packaging, even digital advertisements, where designers are recreating the warmth and personality of vintage hand-painted signs. And we can't forget about calligraphy. The calligraphic letter styles also influenced typefaces with flourished scripts, elegant flowing lines, and decorative swashes and loops, which are often now used in things like wedding invitations, certificates, and maybe luxury branding. Fonts like Snell, Roundhand, and Great Vibes are directly inspired by calligraphic traditions of the early 20th century. And the 1920s in particular were heavily influenced by the Art Deco movement, which prioritized geometric shapes, symmetry, and streamlined forms. These typefaces often featured tall, elegant letters with sharp angles and minimalistic decoration, reflecting the modernist sensibilities of the time. Yet they still seem pretty vintage to us. The Serif Deco fonts were often sharp and thin, while the sans serif fonts were sleek and bold, reflecting that industrial optimism of the time. Now, the Art Deco movement inspired typefaces like Broadway, Metropolis, and Decotech that are frequently used in modern design projects looking to capture more of that elegance or luxury of the 20s and 30s. Just think of The Great Gatsby, and that will give you a pretty good idea of what we're talking about here. Now, between 1920 and 1930, the Bauhaus movement arrived, led from Germany. The Bauhaus style promoted simplicity, functionality, and geometric design in all forms of art, including typography. Designers began stripping away unnecessary elements, which contributed to the rise of the sans serif font. We begin to see ultra-clean sans serif typefaces like Futura in 1927 and Gil Sans in 1928, which were used extensively during the mid-century. But these fonts were completely devoid of any decorative flourishes from previous eras for a more minimal and efficient look. Now, obviously, that was an extremely brief synopsis over one point in history, but I have a great book on the Bauhaus period if you want to learn more about it, and that book is linked down in the same list I mentioned before. Now, by the 1940s and 50s, typography and design started to reflect the broader cultural trends of mid-century modernism. Type in this era was influenced by clean, functional forms with an emphasis on readability and simplicity, bringing us into the late 1950s with Helvetica and Universe, which are typefaces that became staples in commercial design. And that brings us finally into the 21st century and the rise of digital typography. In the 1960s, photo typesetting comes onto the scene, and this is actually a widely forgotten form of typesetting. Yet it was pretty important because instead of having an entire cabinet full of individual letters, you could have a single disc or column with every letter on it ready to use. Photo typesetting is a method of setting type using photography. Columns of type are created on a scroll of photographic paper, and to actually set the type, the letters are quickly projected with light through a film negative, and the projection would be an individual character of a font. The machine would have a lens that increases or decreases the size of the character onto photographic paper or film. So once all of that type is set, that film is then collected, placed into 2 or 3 baths of chemicals to develop, and then finally, what you've typed is ready for use. Now, honestly, this process is a bit confusing. And if you're just hearing about it now, it pretty much just sounds like magic. So if you really want to go deep and see a proper demonstration, there's a great YouTube video I found. I'll link down in the description with diagrams to show you exactly what's happening to produce these typographic negatives. But because you actually couldn't see what you were doing, these machines were quickly left to the wayside. I mean, you had to be extremely careful when picking your characters, and the only way that you could actually know where you were on the page was from scales and guides on the front of the machine that would tell you where you are on the page. Now, to me, that kind of sounds like trying to write by hand on a straight line while you're blindfolded. But as we move into the 1980s, the typography game changes forever. Instead of using metal or wood type or painting by hand or using a projected film machine, typefaces were now designed on computers. With the introduction of the Mac computer in 1984, and softwares like Illustrator and Photoshop following in 1987, typography became more accessible to the masses and designers had total control over type. What was once an intensely laborious task was now instantaneous on a computer. By just selecting the typeface of your choice, laying out exactly how you want it, and having free reign over size and form that could easily adapt to any use case you were working on. And it's really, truly amazing to look back at how rapidly digital type progressed. I mean, in 1968, you have the very first digital typeface. In 1975, we have type in vector format. And finally, in 1997, we have open type files, which are available and used on both Mac and PC devices. And speaking of the 90s, the distribution of the internet presented a new challenge for type. We don't think about this very often, but early web designers were really limited to a few system fonts like Arial, Verdana, and Times New Roman. It wasn't until about 2009 or 2010 where we see the development of a web font and services like Google Fonts, which allow designers to use a wide variety of fonts across the web. And in 2011, the launch of Glyphs, a font design tool, allows so many different styles of type to come easily to the digital format. Now, of course, there were tools to create digital typefaces before 2000s, like the Fontographer or Font Lab system, but it wasn't until the more robust web-optimized features were available when we see a typographic boom around 2010 and 2011. And since that typographic boom, we've had some amazing advances in type like variable fonts. A variable font is a format that was released in 2016, which allows for multiple styles and weights to be included in one font file, which offers designers more flexibility and performance in both web and print design. So as opposed to having to go into the type settings and choose a specific weight like regular, thin, or bold, you can now easily manipulate your text with a slider to go through all of the possible weights that would otherwise be difficult to list in totality. And just like we saw trends in typography through each different time period, we obviously have font trends today. And one of them is the clear dominance of sans serif fonts. It seems like so much of the business and product world is investing in this clean, minimalist sans serif font, and they continue to dominate web and print design. And this really does make a lot of sense based on legibility and organization. But what's exciting to me is how many brands and companies are commissioning their own custom typefaces in order to stand out and strengthen their own visual identity. Sure, the structure of the letters may be defined to a certain category, like sans serif, but each of these custom fonts have their own character and they are influenced by the culture or the nature of the company. And it's always so fascinating to see them develop over time. And as more of life seems to take place from smaller screens like your phone, we also see responsive typography being a key in design trends, ensuring that type looks good and readable on any screen size. And just like that, somehow we've come from engraving icons on clay and stone to autonomously resizing digital type on your LED screen. So I hope that you see the importance in walking through this history, because I think it is crucial in understanding the roots of modern typography, as well as realizing how amazing and easy it is to pretty much replicate any sort of typographic form imaginable for almost any intended use case. From your logos and your packaging designs, books, posters, web design, whatever else, all of it has been heavily influenced by the type in each time period, and therefore makes it the most powerful element of visual communication in the digital age, at least in my opinion. But you tell me what you think. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments about the history of typography, and I'd love to know what your favorite fonts are. I'd even love to know what you work on the most, where you have to utilize the most amount of typography. And if you are interested in diving deeper into one of these time periods I talked about, or one specific style of type, definitely let me know and we can have a look at doing a deep dive video dedicated to that style. And don't forget to check out the link to the books that I mentioned down in the description, because you're also going to find links to other books that I think would be influential and helpful for you, especially for beginners. And by the way, if you're new here to the channel and to Kittl, I'm so glad you found us. My name is Drew and I run the production team at Kittl, responsible for tutorials, videos, and masterclasses like the one you are watching right now. And Kittl is a design tool that works right in your browser, allowing you to work on your design projects, collaborate with others, easily share and showcase your own designs, and get access to tons of custom-made typefaces, elements, illustrations, and advanced editing features. So if any of that sounds like something you want to try out, you can sign up using the link below and grab one of our free trials, or you can use the promo code to get a discount off of your first subscription. I have plenty of trainings and tutorials here on the channel, so don't hesitate to check those out, or you can join the Discord community and ask any questions you have there. We truly appreciate your time and attention watching this video and can't wait to see you in the next one.